Beyond classic criminal offenses, we start getting into crimes that pop up in connection with laws outside the criminal code. And you can think of these as regulatory laws. And very often, when we're dealing with what we'll see in this next little section, strict liability offenses, we're actually dealing with crimes that aren't really so much about what you've done as about what you haven't done. And often these will apply to companies more than they'll apply directly to people. I mean, they will apply to people as well, but they most often get prosecuted against companies. Strict liability offenses are sometimes also called public welfare offenses because what they're about is they're holding companies criminally liable to be fined and to have other measures brought against them for failing to take enough care to protect people, right? And really this is important because some things like trucking laws or whatever it is, that if companies aren't threatened with criminal consequences for some of what they could do, then they have a pretty big incentive to break the rules in order to shave costs. So strict liability offenses are often about trying to convince companies, look, don't cut corners in order to save a little bit of money. Actually pay the money to do the work properly. Otherwise, we'll punish you criminally. So in these strict liability offenses, it's not that the company has to want to have a thing happen, and there's a reason for that. It's very, very difficult to show that a company wants something bad to happen, right? It's tough to find a smoking gun in their paperwork where they're saying, like, yes, we want people to get killed in car crashes because we're not going to do quality control on the brake pads, whatever it is. Instead, you just have to show that the person didn't do enough to stop this thing from happening. The mens rea is kind of failing to live up to a responsibility. This probably sounds a lot like civil negligence to you. And this is important that it's kind of a lower standard here. You're not. You might even have an accused who wanted the opposite thing to happen, right? They didn't want people to have their brake pads give out on them because it gives the company a bad reputation. But even if they wanted the opposite thing to happen, they could still be found guilty essentially on a basis of negligence. And you can go to prison for some of these strict liability offenses, which is where things get complicated, right? And the Supreme Court looked at this in one of the flagship cases on strict liability. There's a case called Crown versus the City of Sault Ste. Marie. Sault Ste. Marie is in northwestern Ontario, and the story was that the Crown, the government, prosecuted the city because of how it built its dump, right? You see the bears here. They had built a city dump, and there were laws in place, federal laws in place, saying that the city has to be careful in building its dump so as not to cause too much pollution. Well, the city built a garbage dump next to a protected creek, and when the dump got filled, predictably, garbage started to seep into the creek and pollute it and kill all the wildlife in the creek, contrary to federal environmental protection legislation. It's not that the city wanted this to happen. And all that had to happen was that the prosecution just had to show, look, we don't care whether they wanted the creek fish to die. We only need to show that they had a responsibility to not have the creek be polluted, and they didn't take care that this didn't happen. They put the dump there, and we all saw what happened. So even if the law doesn't explicitly say so, what this decision said is these kinds of crimes, you can't give a possibility of jail time unless you really give the person that you're prosecuting an opportunity to show, no, look, I know I'm being charged criminally here, but I actually did take steps that show that I wanted this to not happen. So in these cases, strict liability cases, it's up to the prosecution to show this responsibility existed, in this example, not to have the dump pollute the creek. They failed to live up to their responsibility because we see that the creek did get polluted. And then it falls to the city in this case, or whoever is the defense, to show, okay, I know it looks bad, but let me show you that I actually exercised due diligence here. Okay, so what does that defense entail? What does due diligence entail? Due diligence is essentially you showing, yeah, it was my fault, but I actually really tried pretty hard to avoid having this happen. Right? Like, let's say, for example, based on the license that you have to operate a bar, you're not allowed to have people in your bar offering prostitution services. Okay, if the police come in and raid your place and they happen to find like somebody is sitting in the corner and essentially operating out of your bar to offer prostitution, you could lose your license. But what your defense could be is if you show that you actually have a bouncer who, circulates through the club and tries to make sure that nobody is offering prostitution in the bar, then that could be your defense to saying, I actually did take reasonable steps. Even though the bad thing did happen, even though I'm guilty of not preventing it, I did my best to try and prevent it. Okay, and this defense has to exist, even if the law doesn't specify that in the piece of legislation. The courts will say this defense exists, even if the law doesn't explicitly say it, if there is a possibility of jail time. The last one I'll look at just very briefly is offenses of absolute liability. This essentially means that there's no mens rea required at all, that you can be found guilty even if you didn't know that this was a problem and you had no desire of it. These are really, really, really rare. And essentially the only example I can ever think of is parking tickets, right? If the car is parked in a place that it's not allowed to be at the wrong time, then there's no defense of due diligence. You can't say, well, I looked for every other parking spot possible. I was running out of gas. I didn't want to leave in the middle of the street, so actually I did run out of gas, and I just pushed the car into the spot and put on the parking brake to avoid disrupting traffic. They'll still say, look, parking tickets are going to kick in here. It doesn't matter your due diligence. It doesn't matter your intention. We're just going to give you the ticket. The reason for that is because it's for very minor infractions. We're going into the complicated question of mens rea and intention. It's just a waste of time. So we're going to say that intention doesn't matter at all. Now, because intention doesn't matter at all, if you're going to be ticketed for these offenses, it can only be offenses that don't involve jail time. If jail time is there, then it stops being an absolute liability offense, even if the piece of legislation explicitly says this offense is a strict liability offense. A court will still look at it and say, well, there's jail time as a possibility here, so we're going to interpret it as strict liability, and you do have a defense of due diligence.